I thought my boundaries protected me from getting hurt, but I never expected someone to make me question why I built them in the first place. My name is Ethan Brooks, and for most of my life I was known as the person who kept things simple. I showed up, did what I needed to do, and avoided letting people get too close. It was not because I disliked people. It was because I had learned that keeping a little distance made life easier. When you do not expect too much from others, you cannot be disappointed. At least that was what I believed. Then I met Noah Parker. The first thing I noticed about Noah was that he paid attention to details most people ignored. He remembered small things I mentioned in passing. He noticed when I was quieter than usual. He asked questions that were not meant to be polite conversations but actually showed that he wanted to understand me. At first, I thought it was unusual. Most people accepted the version of me that I showed them. Noah seemed interested in the parts one rarely shared. We met through a mutual friend at a small coffee shop in downtown Chicago. It was a normal afternoon, the kind of day that usually disappears from memory. But somehow that conversation stayed with me. Noah had an easy confidence that made talking feel natural. He was open, honest, and comfortable being himself. I was the opposite. I measured my words carefully and usually avoided conversations that became too personal. During our first meeting, Noah asked me a simple question. He asked why I always seemed prepared to leave before anyone had a chance to know me. I laughed because I thought he was joking, but he was not. He had noticed something I had spent years trying to hide. I told him I just liked having my own space. That was true, but it was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that space felt safe. Over time, Noah started challenging the small boundaries I had created. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me notice them. If I changed the subject when conversations became personal, he would gently bring me back. If I dismissed something I cared about, he would remind me that it was okay to admit something mattered. I was not used to someone noticing those things. Most people respected the distance I created without questioning it. Noah was different. He did not try to remove my boundaries. He simply made me wonder if some of them were still necessary. That was what surprised me the most. I expected to feel annoyed when someone looked past the walls I had built. Instead, I found myself curious. Why did I react that way? Why did I feel comfortable around someone who saw through the things I usually kept hidden? The more time I spent with Noah, the more I realized something important. My boundaries were not just about protecting my peace. Some of them were also protecting my fears. I had spent so much time convincing myself that I did not need anyone too close that I never asked whether I actually wanted that distance. And Noah was the first person who made me ask that question. I did not know it then, but meeting him would become the beginning of a journey that would change how I understood trust, connection, and myself. The first thing I learned about Noah Parker was that he never forced conversations. He never demanded answers or tried to make me explain things I was not ready to share. Somehow, that made his questions even harder to ignore. Most people accepted my silence because they thought that was simply who I was. Noah seemed to understand that silence was not always comfort. Sometimes it was just a habit I had created over time. After our first meeting, we started talking more often. At first, it was casual conversations about everyday things. We talked about work, hobbies, places we wanted to visit, and random moments that made us laugh. It felt easy, and that was something I was not used to. Usually, when someone tried to get closer, I would find a reason to create distance. I would become busy, change the subject, or convince myself that keeping things simple was better. But with Noah, those usual habits became harder to follow. He noticed when I avoided certain topics, but instead of pushing, he simply gave me a reason to think about them. One evening, we were sitting at a quiet cafe after work when Noah asked me why I always seemed uncomfortable accepting compliments. I immediately laughed and told him that was not true. But even as I said it, I knew he had noticed something real. I had always been better at recognizing the value in other people than accepting it for myself. When someone said something kind about me, I usually found a way to dismiss it. Noah smiled and said he thought I spent too much time trying to convince myself that I did not need encouragement from anyone. That comment stayed in my mind because it felt surprisingly accurate. I had spent years believing independence meant never needing support. I thought relying on others meant giving away control. But Noah helped me see that there was a difference between being independent and refusing to let anyone understand you. The small moments continued. If I said I was too busy to take a break, Noah would remind me that rest was not something I had to earn. If I talked about a goal I had but immediately explained why it might not work, he would ask why I was already preparing myself to fail. He was not criticizing me. He was simply pointing out patterns I had never noticed. At first, that made me uncomfortable. It is strange when someone notices things about you that you have spent years ignoring. I wondered why his observations affected me so much. After all, Noah was not telling me who to become. He was not asking me to change everything about myself. He was just encouraging me to be honest about what I actually felt. The more I thought about it, the more I realized my boundaries had become automatic. I created them before people even had the chance to show me whether they could be trusted. I decided what others would think before they ever had the opportunity to prove me wrong. Noah was the first person who made me question that approach. One day, he asked me a simple question that I could not stop thinking about. He asked, "Do you keep people at a distance because you are comfortable there? Or because you are afraid of what happens if someone gets closer?" I did not have an answer right away, but I knew the question mattered. For the first time, I started wondering if the walls I built were protecting me or preventing me from experiencing something meaningful. For years, I believed I understood the reason behind my boundaries. I told myself they were there because I valued my independence and because I knew how to handle life on my own. But after spending more time with Noah Parker, I started realizing that my boundaries were not created from confidence. Many of them came from experiences I never fully processed. Noah did not discover this by looking into my past. He discovered it by paying attention to the way I reacted to simple moments. He noticed how quickly I changed subjects when conversations became personal. He noticed how I minimized my own achievements. He noticed how I would offer support to everyone else but rarely allow anyone to support me. Eventually, I started asking myself why I acted that way. The answer was connected to a time in my life when I learned to rely only on myself. I had always been the person who solved problems quietly. When something was difficult, I handled it without asking for help. I thought that was a strength. In many ways, it was. But I never noticed when that strength turned into a habit of keeping everyone at a safe distance. I remembered how often I avoided being honest about what I needed because I did not want to appear vulnerable. I worried that if people saw too much of the real me, they might eventually decide I was not worth staying for. It was a thought I rarely admitted, even to myself. One evening, Noah and I were walking through a neighborhood park after dinner. The city lights reflected on the sidewalks, and the conversation naturally became quieter. Noah asked me if I had ever considered that protecting myself could also mean preventing good things from reaching me. At first, I did not know how to respond. I wanted to disagree because accepting that idea meant admitting something I had avoided for a long time. I had not only been protecting myself from disappointment, I had also been protecting myself from connection. I told Noah that trusting people had never been easy for me. I explained that I always felt more comfortable when I knew exactly what to expect. Uncertainty made me uncomfortable because it meant giving someone else the ability to affect how I felt. Noah listened carefully and told me something that changed the way I looked at boundaries. He said that healthy boundaries were not meant to block everyone out. They were meant to help people understand how to respect each other. The difference was that I had been using my boundaries like a locked door instead of a door with a choice. That conversation stayed with me for days. I started noticing how often I automatically rejected kindness before even considering it. When someone offered support, I immediately searched for a reason I did not need it. When someone showed interest in my life, I wondered what they expected in return. I realized I had been preparing for people to leave before they even had the chance to stay. Noah never asked me to remove every boundary or become a completely different person. He never suggested that I should ignore my instincts. Instead, he encouraged me to understand where those instincts came from. That was the difference. He was not trying to break down the walls I built. He was helping me understand why I built them. And for the first time in years, I began to wonder what life would feel like if I stopped assuming that closeness always came with a risk. The more I understood myself, the more I realized that Noah Parker had never been the person challenging my boundaries. He was simply the person who made me notice them. That difference changed everything. For a long time, I believed that anyone who got too close was automatically creating a problem. I thought distance was the safest option because it gave me control. But Noah showed me that trust was not about losing control. It was about choosing who deserved a place in my life. After that conversation in the park, I started paying closer attention to the way I interacted with people. I noticed how often I avoided deeper conversations, not because I had nothing to say, but because sharing something personal felt uncomfortable. I had become so familiar with protecting myself that openness felt unfamiliar. Noah continued to be patient. He never rushed me or expected immediate changes. That was one of the things that surprised me most. Had always imagined that someone who wanted to get closer would constantly ask for more. Noah did the opposite. He gave me space while still showing that he cared. One weekend, we spent an afternoon exploring a local street market in Chicago. It was a simple day, but I remember it because I realized something important about Noah. He was not interested only in the version of me that was easy to understand. He was interested in the person behind the careful answers and quiet habits. While we walked through the market, he asked about my childhood and the experiences that shaped how I viewed relationships. Normally, I would have answered briefly and moved the conversation somewhere safer. But that day, I decided to be more honest. I told him that I had always been afraid of depending on someone because I associated dependence with disappointment. I had seen people promise support and then become distant when things became complicated. Because of that, I convinced myself that needing others was a weakness. Noah listened and told me that he understood why I felt that way. He did not try to convince me that my feelings were wrong. Instead, he said that protecting myself had probably helped me during difficult times, but I should not let an old strategy decide how I live forever. That sentence stayed with me. It made me think about how many things we continue doing simply because they once helped us survive a difficult moment. We forget to ask whether those same choices still serve us today. Over the following weeks, I noticed small changes in myself. I started sharing more about my thoughts instead of keeping everything private. I accepted help without immediately trying to return the favor. I allowed conversations to continue instead of searching for an exit. These changes might have seemed small to someone else, but for me, they represented something much bigger. I was learning that being understood did not always mean being judged. One evening, Noah and I sat outside a small cafe after closing time, talking about how people often confuse independence with isolation. He told me that he admired how capable I was, but he hoped I would remember that capable people also deserve support. Hearing that made me realize something I had ignored for years. My boundaries were valuable, but they were not supposed to become barriers. They were supposed to create healthy connections, not prevent them. For the first time, I began seeing my boundaries differently. They were not proof that I could stand alone. They were a reminder that I could choose who I allowed closer. And Noah was slowly becoming someone I wanted to choose. As I became more comfortable letting Noah Parker see the real parts of my life, I started noticing something I had never expected. The more I trusted him, the more I understood that the hardest boundaries to face were not the ones between me and other people. They were the ones I had created inside my own mind. For years, I had believed that keeping my emotions controlled was a sign of maturity. I thought being unaffected meant I was strong. But slowly, I began to understand that strength was not about avoiding every difficult feeling. Sometimes, strength was being honest about what mattered. Noah never tried to convince me that I needed to change overnight. He simply asked questions that made me look deeper. One evening, we were sitting at a quiet coffee shop near Lake Michigan, talking about our goals and the things we wanted for the future. The conversation was relaxed until Noah asked me something I did not expect. He asked if I was more afraid of losing my independence or more afraid of allowing someone to become important to me. I looked at him and realized I did not have an immediate answer. That question stayed with me because I knew it touched something I had avoided for a long time. I had always told myself that I valued freedom above everything else. but maybe part of me had confused freedom with never allowing anyone to matter too much. I told Noah that I had spent years making sure I could handle everything alone. I explained that relying only on myself felt predictable. If I only depended on myself, then I never had to worry about someone changing their mind or leaving unexpectedly. Noah listened carefully and then said something that changed the way I viewed the entire situation. He told me that trust was not built because someone proved they would never disappoint you. Trust was built when two people understood that they could face uncertainty together. That idea was new to me. I had always searched for guarantees before opening up. I wanted to know that everything would be safe before I allowed myself to care. But life never really worked that way. Every meaningful connection required some level of courage. After that conversation, I started seeing Noah differently. Before, I thought he was challenging my comfort zone. Now, I realized he was showing me that comfort and growth were not always the same thing. Sometimes the things that make us uncomfortable are the same things that help us become better versions of ourselves. A few days later, Noah asked me about something I had mentioned briefly before. He remembered a personal goal I had almost forgotten about because I had been too focused on daily responsibilities. That small moment meant more to me than he probably realized. It showed me that he was not just listening to respond. He was listening to understand. I began to realize that the reason his presence felt different was because he never treated my boundaries as obstacles. He respected them while encouraging me to examine them. There was a difference between someone trying to enter your life without permission and someone waiting patiently for you to open the door yourself. Noah had always given me that choice. And for the first time, I understood that choosing to let someone closer was not a loss of control. It was an act of trust. The person who once made me question my boundaries was actually helping me understand them better. He was not changing who I was. He was helping me discover parts of myself I had kept hidden for too long. The more time I spent with Noah Parker, the more I realized that opening up was not as difficult as I had imagined. The difficult part was accepting that I was allowed to do it. For years, I had treated my emotions like something that needed to be carefully managed. I believed that if I stayed calm, independent, and prepared for every possibility, I could avoid disappointment. But Noah helped me understand that constantly preparing for things to go wrong could also prevent me from experiencing things that were good. One Saturday morning, Noah and I met at a small bookstore near downtown Chicago. It was a simple plan, just coffee and walking around the shelves, but I remember that day because it felt different. I was no longer thinking about how much space I needed between us. I was simply enjoying the moment. That realization surprised me. In the past, I would have analyzed every interaction, wondering if I was becoming too comfortable or if I was sharing too much. With Noah, those thoughts were becoming quieter. During our conversation, he asked me about the things I wanted to accomplish in the future. Instead of giving the usual answer about practical goals and responsibilities, I actually talked about something personal. I told him about a dream I had put aside because I convinced myself it was unrealistic. As soon as I finished explaining, I almost changed the subject. That was my usual habit. I would share something meaningful and then immediately make it seem less important. But Noah noticed. He smiled and asked why I always tried to minimize the things that mattered to me. I did not have an answer. It was something I had done for so long that I never questioned it. Noah told me that people often create boundaries because they are afraid of being misunderstood. They hide parts of themselves because they think those parts might not be accepted. Hearing that made me think about all the times I had edited myself before anyone else had the chance to react. I had been deciding what people would accept without giving them an opportunity to show me. That afternoon, I told Noah something I had never really admitted. I said that part of me was afraid that if someone knew everything about me, they might eventually realize I was not the person they thought I was. Noah looked at me and said that everyone has parts of themselves they are still learning to understand. He explained that being known was not about showing someone a perfect version of yourself. It was about allowing someone to see the real version and choosing to stay connected anyway. Those words stayed with me because they changed the way I viewed trust. I had always thought trust was something people earned by proving they would never hurt me. But I started to understand that trust was also about accepting that no relationship could come with complete certainty. The next few weeks brought small but meaningful changes. I started speaking more honestly. I stopped apologizing for having feelings or interests that mattered to me. I allowed conversations to go deeper without searching for a reason to step away. Noah never celebrated these changes as if he had fixed something about me. He simply treated them as a natural part of getting to know someone. That was what made it feel genuine. He was not trying to create a different person. He was encouraging me to be more comfortable being myself. For the first time, I realized that my boundaries were not disappearing. They were becoming healthier. I was still choosing what I shared and who I trusted. The difference was that I was no longer making those choices based only on fear. I was making them based on understanding. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was no longer running from the possibility of being understood. I was not suddenly a completely different person, and I still valued my personal space, but something inside me had changed. I was no longer seeing every emotional connection as a risk. I was beginning to see it as a choice. Noah Parker had never asked me to become someone else. He had only encouraged me to stop hiding the parts of myself that I had already decided were too difficult for others to understand. But just when I thought I had finally figured everything out, I discovered that opening up came with its own challenges. The truth was, feeling comfortable with someone also meant accepting that you could eventually feel disappointed. That was the part one had always tried to avoid. One evening, Noah and I were sitting outside a small cafe after dinner, talking about our week. The conversation was easy, but I noticed that Noah seemed quieter than usual. Normally, I would have ignored it. I would have assumed he wanted space and convinced myself not to ask questions. That was the old version of me. Instead, I asked if everything was okay. It was a simple question, but for me, it represented a huge change. I was no longer waiting for people to explain themselves without giving them the opportunity to share. Noah smiled and said he was fine, but he admitted he was surprised that I asked. He told me that before, I often noticed when something was different but rarely said anything. Hearing that made me realize how much I had changed. I used to think caring about someone meant quietly paying attention from a distance. Now I was learning that caring also meant being willing to communicate. Later that week, Noah and I had a conversation about expectations. He told me that one of the reasons he respected my boundaries was because he knew they were important to me. But he also said that sometimes people create boundaries so carefully that they forget to leave room for unexpected happiness. That idea stayed with me. I started thinking about all the opportunities one might have avoided because I was afraid of uncertainty. I remembered how many times I had walked away from connections before they had the chance to become meaningful. Not because those people had done something wrong, but because I had already decided that distance was safer. Noah helped me understand that boundaries should guide relationships, not prevent them from existing. A few days later, I shared something with him that I had rarely talked about. I told him about a moment in my past when I learned to rely only on myself. It was not a dramatic story. It was simply a collection of experiences that slowly taught me to keep my emotions private. Noah listened without interrupting. He did not try to give me quick advice or tell me how I should feel. He simply understood. That moment meant more than I expected because I realized I was no longer trying to prove that I could handle everything alone. I was allowing someone to know me. As time passed, I noticed that Noah was not just someone who challenged my comfort zone. He was someone who respected it. There was a difference between pushing someone and encouraging them. Noah had always understood that difference. He never wanted access to every part of my life. He wanted me to feel safe enough to share the parts one chose. And that was when I finally understood the lesson behind everything that had happened. The strongest boundaries were not the ones that kept everyone away. They were the ones that helped me recognize who I could trust enough to let closer. As my connection with Noah Parker continued to grow, I started realizing that the biggest change was not happening between us. It was happening inside me. For so long, I had believed that letting someone closer meant giving them the ability to disrupt my life. I thought independence meant needing nothing from anyone. But I was slowly learning that a meaningful connection did not take away my independence. It added something valuable to it. Noah never tried to become the center of my world. He simply became someone I trusted enough to share parts of it with. That difference mattered more than I expected. One afternoon, Noah and I walked along the lakefront in Chicago. The weather was calm, and the city felt quieter than usual. We talked about simple things, from our favorite places to visit to the small routines that made our days better. At one point, Noah asked me if I noticed how different I seemed compared to when we first met. I laughed and asked what he meant. He said that before, I always looked like I was preparing for the next reason to leave. I wanted to disagree, but I knew he was right. I had spent so much time protecting myself that I rarely allowed myself to fully enjoy moments as they happened. I told Noah that I was still learning how to balance being careful with being open. I did not want to lose the boundaries that helped me feel comfortable. But I also did not want fear to decide everything for me anymore. Noah smiled and said that was exactly the point. Boundaries were not supposed to disappear when someone earned your trust. They were supposed to become clearer. That conversation helped me understand something I had misunderstood for years. I used to think boundaries were about keeping people away. Now I realized they were about creating the kind of connection where both people felt respected. They were not walls built from fear. They were guidelines built from understanding. A few days later, Noah and I had a deeper conversation about the future. He asked me what kind of life I wanted to create and what things truly mattered to me. Instead of giving a practical answer like I usually did, I shared what I actually hoped for. I talked about experiences I wanted to have, places I wanted to see, and the kind of person I wanted to become. I noticed something while I was speaking. I was not filtering my thoughts. I was not checking whether my answers sounded reasonable enough. I was simply being honest. Afterward, I realized that was one of the biggest changes Noah had brought into my life. He did not make me more open by convincing me to trust him. He made me more open by showing me that I could trust myself. I could recognize when someone respected my boundaries. I could recognize when a connection felt healthy. I could make choices without always expecting something to go wrong. That realization gave me a sense of confidence I had never experienced before. I no longer felt like I had to choose between protecting myself and allowing someone to know me. I could do both. As I looked back on everything that happened, I understood why Noah's presence had affected me so much. He was not challenging my boundaries because he wanted to cross them. He was challenging the beliefs I had attached to them. He helped me see that my boundaries were not signs that I was difficult to understand. They were part of who I was, and the right person would respect them while still wanting to know me better. For the first time, I was not afraid of being seen. I was beginning to understand that being known by someone was not a weakness. Sometimes, it was the greatest form of trust. Looking back at everything that happened with Noah Parker, I realized the biggest change was not that someone entered my life. The biggest change was that I finally stopped believing I had to keep everyone at a distance to protect myself. For years, I thought my boundaries were proof that I was strong. I believed that handling everything alone meant I was independent and prepared. But through knowing Noah, I discovered that real strength was not about never needing anyone. It was about understanding myself well enough to choose who I trusted and why. Noah never asked me to become someone different. He never told me that my habits were wrong or that the way I protected myself was something I should be ashamed of. Instead, he helped me see the difference between protecting my peace and protecting myself from connection. That difference changed the way I looked at relationships, trust, and even my own identity. I remembered the first time Noah noticed the walls I had built. At the time, I wondered why he paid attention to things I tried so hard to hide. Now I understand that he was not searching for weaknesses. He was noticing the parts of me that I had ignored for years. He saw that behind my confidence was someone who wanted to be understood but was afraid of what would happen if I allowed that. Over time, I learned that the right people do not make you feel like you have to choose between independence and connection. They respect your space while still showing that they care. Noah showed me that trust is not created by someone proving they will never disappoint you. Trust is created when two people are honest enough to accept that no one is perfect. There will always be uncertainty, but that does not mean every connection should be avoided. One evening, Noah and I sat together near the lake and talked about how much had changed since we first met. I told him that I never expected someone to make me question my own boundaries. He smiled and said he never wanted to change them. He only wanted me to understand them. That sentence stayed with me because it represented everything I had learned. Boundaries were not about keeping people away. They were about knowing myself well enough to decide who deserved to come closer. They were about respect, honesty, and the freedom to make my own choices. As time passed, I continued to notice small changes in myself. I became more comfortable expressing what I thought. I became more willing to accept support. I stopped assuming that every connection would eventually lead to disappointment. I allowed myself to experience moments without constantly preparing for an ending. The person I became was not someone completely different from who I had been before. I was still thoughtful. I still valued my space. I still believed that boundaries mattered. The difference was that I no longer saw them as barriers. I saw them as a way to create healthier connections. Noah entered my life at a time when I believed protecting myself was the only way to stay safe emotionally. But he helped me understand something much more important. Protecting myself did not mean closing every door. It meant knowing which doors I was willing to open. And when I finally understood that, I realized the person who challenged my boundaries was never trying to take away my control. He was helping me discover that I had always been the one with the choice.